Martinez, California, May 21, 1976, 10:55, the morn. A chartered bus carry in the Yuba City High School a cappella, Chower took the Mar Navista Avenue off-ramp from southbound Interstate 680 on its way to a French exchange with the Chower at Emramonte H School or Inda. It was a spring day. 52 passengers were aboard, most of them students between 14 and EP, along 4th adult chaperones, plus the drufferant, 53 people in total. 14 newts earlier, nothing about that trup had looked different from 100 other out of duff, East Treffer-sealed trups that spring. The bus was a 1950 Crown Coach Supercoach, chartered from a company called Student Transported Tat, on El Nays Inc. It was painted the fam immerse was yellow. It had the words school bus stenciled on tame, body and the roof-mounted butts that flash when children cross the road. On Cherpel's part ecular morn, both had been taped over, under California regulat. On it the Timmy, that piece of tape was enough to legally convert the Vaux from a school bus to a charter bus, a different VIs of the law, reckon a different kind of driver. The man behind the wheel, 14-year-old Evan Prothero of Olvehurst, held a camarilla sense to drive almost anything on a California road. He was not cert as a school bus driver. Under the charter class, cat on, he'd not need to be. A small eel came on the dashboard as the bus approached the off-ramp. Prothero'd not know yet what meant. What tape Yob? That piece of tape actually change. About the vehicle, about the law, and about who was responsible for the bus. These children were ring. Before we can tell any, and if documentat on's what you've been looking for, consider subscribe. Every video on this channel goes into one spec. See element of American school bus culture from 1930 to 1980, what the bus was, how the route worked, and what the driver and the channel drin. It knew that no school drin Easter record ever captured, not nostalgia for yellow buses. The documented operatal and human reality of a system that carried an engine, or generate onto school. The gap's crash exposed wasn't a broken belt, was the assumpted gen, shared by parents, a school gen, and a state regulator, that a bus with children's names on a roster was automat Aldrin's names on a roster was automat Aldrin's names of the year, and you rode a school bus and thirst one, or drove one, put in the comments. If you were in a school show, band, or team the 1970s and rode a chartered bus to an away event, do you remember whether anyone ever told you who the driver was, or whether that bus was really a school bus at all? Scratch where the modern rule that a charter bus carry can cries must be inspected and due to the same standard as a D school bus began to take shape. And that story continues. A future VHO on the 1977 Federal Safety Overhaul. Back on Route 680, a Crown Coach Supercoach was belief on an integrated body and chassis, powered by a rake over the rear-wheel drum brakes, a system standard on heavy vehicles of its brakes on, and one that behaves very differently from the hydraulic brakes on a passenger car. A brakes depend on a compressor, driven off the end by a belt continuously refif in a reservo or tank. If that belt falls, the reservo does not empty instantly. It empties gradually over pumps of the pedal, each one a little weaker than the last, which means a driver who does not know this particular gauge on this particular bus can be several pedal presses to a facular system before the fall lure becomes undamnable. This was not a leaden defect. It was a documented character of every sentence of every abraked vehicle on a mare. Can roads in 1976, and a fact that any cert first school bus covered training program of the era covered directly. Know your gauges, know your worn sights, before you know your route. Evan Prothero had neither. He had a comm sense. He did not have that spec ret struck on. The compressor drabbled that fouled on bus number 16 did not foul ball warn. NTSB. Investigators later determine. End of wear a pre-trap. Inspect on a spec. Eckley designing to catch. On the morn of May 21st, that inspect on a. There did not happen at all. Investigators found the maintenance record for the spec U charter run inadequate to the standard record for a vehicle carrying more than FT Chandran, where the story stops being about one man's red gauge and becomes about a system. Student transported on L. Nays Incorporated, supplied a bus that was, on paper, available and roadworthy. The company was not required, under the charter class CAT, on to cert, feach jar, for school bus standards, because the vehicle itself, with not legally a school bus for trop. Yuba School had contracted a charter serve, is the way a dist contract any vendor for an away trust, trusting that bus meant the same, whether the passengers were commuters or trust. There were signs on the road self, before the off-ramp. Students later told investigators the bus door, held shut by a pressure, had begun blowing open somewhere along the drive, a physical symptom of the same pressure loss bulled in toward the compressor's folder. Apparent drive be in the bus on I-680 near far, ild not something in flappin' beneath, the loose end of the broken belt, draggin' ance the road. Tever observe it on reach the derever, a form he recognized as urgent, a door that opens unexpectedly on a mover bus as alarm. It's not to someone what thou tron. It's specs mechan system, self of weddingly a break warn. If a pre-trop inspect on desk mean, to catch exactly thund of where, what of mean, for the bus, there's driver, and the 52 passengers behover, that the inspect on record for a charter V was not the same inspect on record for a dest school bus. To understand why a bus with taped-over marks could legally carry 52 children, 1976, you need to understand what the 1939 Nat Monal School Bus Standards Conference had, and had not, accomplished. That conference, convened New York, produced the spec for CAT, as that made the American school bus a recognizable nat anal object. The spec is shade of yellow chosen for V, is T standard teased body, men's per passenger compartment. It governed what a school bus, built as a school bus and operated as a school bus, had to be. It sat at almost known about charter reclass. Cat on about what happened when a domextin needed transported on for an out of duff. It's trape and turned to a commercial operator whose vehicle must once have been a school bus, I'd currently be registered as one, but was, for specific contract, operating under a different set of rules. That gap was not uncooled to California. In 1976, it existed, some form, in most states, a field trop, a chower exchange, an away game, any trop outs, the dolly route nearly moved, outs the framework that governed the dolly route, into a patchwork of state charter regulast ons that had grown up around gel passenger transport, not children's transport spec, efcally. The fams who put the bus children on bus number 16 that morn, were not being careless. They were relying on a reasonable assumption, on that a yellow bus, chartered by their own school, joven under a state suitable sense, met whatever standard a school bus was supposed to meet. The regulated not require that assumped on to be true. What it mean for the Cho students of Yuba City High School, in what looked, in every visible way, like their own school bus, that the actual standard govern, in spec for you bus, in chip, was not the one their parents believed applied. The Yuba Cedar had made trapses before, a friendship day with another school's chore was a wrecking seized of event on the Metter's 1970s school calendar, an out of dues to exchange, a full day away, a bus day, long enough that students settled to the way they settled into any hundred mentally, to any hundred mentally. Folders on laps, conversating ones that rose and fell, the spexy boredom and ant, pat of a fur, day away from ordinary classes. None of the 42 passengers aboard bus number 16 had reason to treat the furrent from any other the Choer program had taken. What the students' dadders, the door that would not stay shut, the strange sound somewhere beneath the floor, rested the way unfam. Sounds on any long bus. Rester to a passenger who's not dark. Worth a comment to the person next to you, not worth demand. Ing the dorver stop the bus. Snot a fey lure of a tent, on the student's part, is what happens on any bus, any decade, when the people equipped to interpret a mechan warn. Ing are not the people set in the passenger seats. The Cho Axer students knew the spec texture of an out of texture. In the part ecular boredom of I-680, the part ecular ant ecular campus ahead. They had no way to know what a fauna brake system sounds like from 6 feet above the axle, because no one had ever needed them to know. At 10:55 that morn, the bus took the Mar to Ista off-ramp, a sharply curved, elevated ramp that investigators later noted had a bridge parapet not built to the standard needed to stop a fully loaded bus. The brakes, drained of pressure, did not respond. The bus struck the realm, rode along roughly 74 feet, and went over. What can be asked, honestly, of passengers, students on a Chopai trust, on a system they had no way to independently verify, when the faux lure that reaches them is not a mechan one, but the faux lure of every layer of inspect on and tran, meant to stand between them and exact morn. The bus fell approximately 22 feet from the off-ramp, land on Roan's roof. The structure crushed down to the base of the one dowing. Of the 53 people aboard, 20 died, 20 each students and 1 adult chaperone. Roughly 24 others were shured, several severely. It remains to this day the deadliest and only transport on safety board has ever investigated. The NAT, only transport on safety boards investigate, conducted the months that followed, did not conclude the single cause. It documented a sequence, a compressor belt that had frayed and gone undetected, in a pre-trapenzuizon unequit, to the vesicle's actual cond, in a dritty operating a spec if a bus, he had never been trade on, under a listens and framework that not require him to be. A dashboard warn system whose low pressure signal was visually system lure enough to a low pressure signal that a dreffer nattered spec if fam, and ready could reasonably confuse the two, and an off-ramp whose sharp curve and undersized bridge parapet were not on their own unusual for elevated Heckley ramps built in that era, but which offered no margin for a vehicle already without brakes. Gators were explicit that that was not a case of one person's recklessness. It was a case of several separate ordtomery, decans a maintenance schedule, a lessons, in category, a state charter regulate, on, a road descends, standard, each reasonable width, its own narrow frame, none of Wes had been built the spec of scenery. Evan Prothero survived the crash righteously, injured, Investigators concluded he had failed to recognize and respond to warn, and he had not been trained to read, not that he had dodged regarded warn, and he understood, when investigate on fins, that no single decans on was reckless, and yet 29 people deck. What does that tell a system about the cane deck? And a failure needs to disaginaga, and it's not the failure of one person's judgment, but the failure of several ordinary deck. To California, as a farm, in commune, roughly say, Enels north of Sacramento, the kind of town where a school chore program is not a peripheral act, is not a town but a v. Able thread in the community's daily, fay, where parents know other parents cho, Ildren by name, where the chower room and the football field and the county fa share the same handful of fam, ear faces from one year to the next. On May 21, 1976, 28 of those famsils or young faces did not come home, along with an adult who had been trusted to travel them. The scale of loss in a town of that say does not detribute the way, in a larger crady. 20 Evite students from one Wexkid school meant nearly every family in Yuba City either lost a child, rectly, or knew, by name, a family that had schooled off. Isses became the days that followed, informal gather, cans for parents seek, in informat on before, informat on, exted to gov. Funerals ran in sequence through the following weeks. Students who had served returned to a school boarding where empty desks the char room were not abstract ones but specophores that spec. You people had sat in 3 days earl. The commune's response in the years that followed was not to let the event recede to a single an. School established a memor, the Chower Memorial Monument, and has held an annual remembrance ceremony there for decades. Sora's Monued, in sore of views of those who died, and the first responders who worked the scene. The gathering has continued for so long that now includes people who were small children, 1976, and are now the ones organ the fold, chars. What does a lit mean for a community that a tragedy lech does not stay conta? Named to one generator. On that 50 years later, the Chorum Star won a place where an enter-town returns, once a year, to hold the spec. Ix we odd of 20 names. Before you can understand what changed a mayor, can school transport it on pole? See, after May 21, 1976, you need to understand what this crash made undiscernible to regulators who had, undiscernible, to regulators who had, rights undon, treated Charter Reclass 76, cat on, as a route, and the administrat if convince. A V, legal status, school bus or charter bus, had been allowed to shupeth a strip of tape with the passengers Ming Dari Nend, fiscally, exactly who they had always been, Aldrin with no independent means of assess, in the qual, ficat-ons of the person dar, ing them, or the condiment of the vehicle they had boarded. In the years that followed, Calmore and other states moved toward closing that gap. Calm the define of what vehicles could be reclass, for student transport, and under what conjures, and requans and requan, more gorus driver, qual, cat, on spec, cackly, for any vehicle carrying school-age passengers, regardless of what the trimp was called on the paperwork. Only, the crash entered the record of a Condrens pitted in the bus, to the school bus safety rulemaking that columnated the following year, a perod much federal standards for school bus construct, and scrutiny of the drivers and companies contracted to move Chowan. T. Itent cons, durably. Connect on is well documented in the general story of post-1976 school transport it. On reform, The spec if federal rule language respond, in subject to this crash, as a subject to this channel, it'll treat more depth, in a future, in sode, sown, deserves more than a summary here. What not change, and could not be changed by any subsequent regulating, was the fact of the 20 people who'd not survived the ramp. Regulating can close a gap for the tramps that have not yet happened. It cannot reach backward. What does on mean that the safest verses on of the system, the one buff what responds to what happened on May 21st, 1976, are waived for every cho or band and team that boarded a bus after that day, but not for the 52 who boarded bus number 16. If this channel's going to keep document in what was in these routes, and the people who drove and rode them, subscribe. There are more buses, more routes, more dune revers, and more children's geograph that were built by Dolly repeated on and never written down. The gap crash exposed wasn't a broken belt. It was the assumption on shared by parents, a school dust, and a state regulator that a bus with children's names on a roster was automatically held to the same standard as the bus that peaked those same Sharons oldrin up every other morn of the year. And you have a memory of a bus, a driver, a route, a warn, and you didn't understand until later, put in the comments if you were a school char, band, or team in the 1970s and rode a chartered bus to an away event. Do you remember whether anyone ever told you who the driver was, or whether that bus was really a school bus at all? Scratch, where the modern rule that a charter bus carried by engine must be inspected, enduring to the same standard as a D. Story can school bus began to take shape, and that story continues, a future VO, on the 1977 Federal Safety Overhaul. Yuba City School Storial holds remembrance ceremony each May at the Cho Cries Memorial Monument. The names read there are not abstractas. They belong to 14, 15, 15, 17, and 14-year-olds who boarded a bus that morn bell ving, as every passenger on every school bus, America Bell eaves without thinking about, that the system stand between them and the road had already done's work. A small ent came on the dashboard of a school bus 1976. It was not hidden, it was not settlant, it was sit indirectly, in front of the person responsible for read, and doing exactly what it was bulled to do, and meant nothing to him, because no one had ever taught him what it meant on this particular bus. 29 people did not make it home. What survived that morn, and was not just an NTSB report or a T-Hornets regulator on, it was a fact that took a generator on to fully absorb, that a warnlet is only as good as the tron, the eyes read in, and that no family send, and a child onto a bus should have to wonder, silently, whether that tron was there.